Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? We turn our gaze now toward the great, timeless expanse, the heart of the southern sands, where the dunes rise like sleeping kings, and the air itself seems ancient, holding secrets long forgotten by the busy markets of the coast. This is the realm where the sun is not merely a light, but a demanding, fiery sovereign, watching over endless miles of saffron and ochre, and where time is measured not by clocks, but by the slow, deliberate journey of the stars across the velvet ceiling of night. Here, the silence is so profound that you might almost hear the earth breathing beneath its heavy mantle of heat, a quiet so deep it forces the restless heart to finally seek stillness and listen to what the grains of the desert have carried across centuries. Our tale finds its footing beside a well of bitter, shallow water, where an old man named Harith rested, his skin etched deep with the maps of 70 summers spent beneath the harsh Arabian sky, his eyes possessing the keen, distant focus of a hawk circling high above the terrain. Harith was not driven by wealth or simple trade, but by the deep, insistent whisper he believed originated in the very fabric of the sand, a pervasive narrative of forgotten days and civilizations swallowed whole by the moving dunes, waiting only for a willing ear. He carried a small, heavily bound scroll, older than his grandfather, which spoke not of gold or emeralds, but of a specific, ancient harmony, a precise tonal vibration that promised safe passage toward a hidden sanctuary deep within the most treacherous, pathless quarter of the empty land. This strange quest had drawn him far from the familiar routes of commerce, forcing him to rely solely on the powerful, guiding intuition the desert grants only to those who cease to fight its overwhelming vastness. The desert's true voice is rarely loud, manifesting instead as a subtle, pervasive tremor known only to the patient traveler. It is the sound of the world's enduring memory shifting restlessly in its sleep, rearranging the millennia beneath its surface. When the wind blew just so, caressing the highest ridges of the towering, sculpted dunes, Harith claimed he could distinguish individual voices and fragments of lost languages within the low, resonant drone, deciphering the accumulated sighs of generations. These were not mere echoes of the passing breeze, but the lament of those who had thirsted, the pure joy of those who had miraculously found water in impossible places, and the stern warnings of jinn guarding their secret treasures and hidden wells. Harith had trained himself over decades to differentiate the sound of a quickly looming sandstorm from the distant, soft laughter of a forgotten riverbed running deep beneath the parched surface, guiding his slow, deliberate passage through the most blinding stretches. His only constant companion was Lila, a dromedary mare of magnificent stamina and uncanny, almost spiritual intelligence, whose broad feet seemed to understand the shifting texture of the terrain better than any human eye could perceive. She moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, conserving vital energy throughout the searing daylight hours, often guiding Harith not by sight, but by scenting the subtle changes in the dry, heated atmosphere and the metallic tang of distant minerals. Their journey was a relentless test of endurance, marked by long days where the horizon seemed to vanish completely into a blinding white glare of reflected light, and nights where the air dropped to a surprising, profound chill, forcing them to huddle close for the faint residual warmth of the day's persistent accumulated heat. Harith understood deeply that in this unforgiving land, one mistake in rationing the meager water supply meant an immediate sentence of dissolution, and that reverence for the desert's power was the only true and lasting shield against utter oblivion. There came a particularly dreadful day when the water supply dipped dangerously low, the fragile clay vessels showing their bare interiors, and the sun beat down with the oppressive weight of hammered copper, causing violent mirages to flicker like mocking flames just beyond his strained reach. He saw great, shimmering lakes bordered by dense thickets of impossibly green date palms heavy with fruit, and heard the clear, splashing sound of a cool waterfall that vanished entirely the moment he blinked his tired, gritty eyes in disbelief. Despair is perhaps the desert's most effective and cunning weapon, and it sought to erode his very core of resolve, suggesting that the whispers were merely the desperate ramblings of a dying, dehydrated mind, urging him to simply lie down in the warm, welcoming sand and cease his futile, tiring pursuit. But Harith gripped the spine of his small, worn scroll, reminding himself with great urgency that true seeking requires persistence even when the failing senses betray the soul, and that the path to profound discovery is often intentionally veiled by overwhelming illusion and exhaustion. But Harith gripped the spine of his small, worn scroll, reminding himself with great urgency that true seeking requires persistence even when the failing senses betray the soul, and that the path to profound discovery is often intentionally veiled by overwhelming illusion and exhaustion. The pages of the ancient scroll described in detail a profound technique of deep, resonant listening, involving not simply using the shallow external ear, but actively using the very bone and the steady spirit to feel the heavy, persistent vibration of the ground, a sacred practice known only to the first, long-vanished inhabitants of the great southern quarter. It explained clearly that the true treasure of the sands was not glittering gold or precious jewels, which are fleeting and corruptible, but preserved memory, accessible only when the traveler's own inner rhythm of breath and heart precisely matched the Earth's slow, seismic pulse. Harith sat in the scarce shade of a small, jagged rock outcropping, placing his palm flat against the baked surface of the ground, trying deliberately to quiet the frantic, survivalist beating of his own heart, until he could perceive the faint, steady drumming originating miles away in the bedrock. He sought the specific tone mentioned explicitly in the text, a sound like 1,000 muffled giant drums beating in perfect, heavy unison, the distinct acoustic signature of the hidden place he yearned to find. After 3 agonizing days of near fasting and intense, deliberate meditation, focusing his entire consciousness only on the subtle, insistent pressure beneath his seeking hand, the world began miraculously to change its tune, shedding the harsh, chaotic crackle of the heat for a low, unwavering, steady thrum. It felt less like a sound arriving from the thin air above and more like a deep, persistent vibration originating deep within his own chest, spreading outward into the very fibers of his being to meet the silent, expectant earth. Suddenly, the chaotic, confusing murmuring of the wind gave way entirely to that specific, deep resonance, not the physical sound of a caravan's travel or a rock slide, but the heavy, measured pulse of monumental, absolute stillness, a deep sound that spoke clearly of foundations laid impossibly deep in the prehistoric stone. This, he realized with a sharp intake of breath, was the undeniable signal he sought, the eternal heartbeat of the lost city mentioned only in the oldest and most sacred of songs. Guided now not by sight, which was treacherous, nor by the stars, which were often obscured by dust haze, but solely by this deep, pervasive humming that resonated in his very bones, Harith pressed forward, Lila following his silent command with the profound obedience of a creature that trusted the guidance implicitly. The quality of the sand changed imperceptibly, becoming firmer, strangely magnetized, and taking on a faint, almost metallic sheen under the midday glare, suggesting immense, buried masses of material lay just beneath the surface. He felt the weight of forgotten history pressing down on him, Sensing the passage of untold thousands of lives who had walked this exact ground when the climate was merciful and the streams still flowed openly into vast ancient lakes. Every footfall now felt like a profound intrusion upon a sacred, sleeping place that did not wish to be awakened by the noise of the living world. The scrolls had warned that the final approach would be guarded not by walls or warriors, but by the ultimate test of faith, a landscape designed entirely to trick the eye and destroy the weary spirit through sheer, terrifying scale and repetition. Ahead of him rose a vast, bewildering maze of identical dunes, each one sculpted precisely the same way by an unrelenting, circular wind current, offering no clear path or distinct landmark to anchor the confused traveler. Harith remembered the text, "The gate is not seen but felt. It is found only where the memory of man and the memory of stone perfectly align." He dismounted from Lila, whispering words of encouragement to the patient animal, knowing that he must enter this final, dizzying labyrinth on foot, relying purely on the internal compass provided by the Earth's measured, rhythmic sound. He moved slowly, deliberately placing one foot directly in front of the other, focusing intently on the slight variation in the subterranean resonance, seeking the exact center point where the pulse was strongest and most steady. The optical illusions were mesmerizing and cruel. He would look back to find his own tracks erased instantaneously by a subtle breath of wind, leaving him with the terrifying sensation that he was trapped in an infinite, self-renewing loop of sand and emptiness. The intense pressure of the air grew heavy, almost viscous, feeling like the air held at the bottom of a deep well, making breathing a conscious and heavy effort that strained his aging body severely. He realized that this place was less about physical distance and more about mental endurance, designed to break the seeker's belief in linear progress and objective reality itself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into a single, painful morning, the deep, persistent thrumming reached a deafening, silent intensity, focusing into a single, vibrating point directly beneath the sole of his worn leather boot. Harith knelt slowly, reverently brushing away the top layer of fine, dry sand, expecting to find perhaps an ancient capstone or the crumbling rim of a hidden well, but found only dark, unnervingly smooth basalt stone, polished by countless millennia of friction. This basalt was oddly cold to the touch, retaining a profound chill that was utterly foreign to the sun-drenched desert surrounding it, suggesting a great depth of earth protecting it from the surface heat. As he pressed his ear against the cold surface, the whispering ceased entirely, replaced by a single, perfectly clear, deep bell tone that resonated upward, vibrating through his entire skull with astonishing, almost painful clarity. This tone was the key, the specific harmonic frequency mentioned in the oldest songs, the signature of Iram, the city of pillars, known now only as the whispering shadow of the sands. As the sound intensified, the ground around the basalt disk began to tremble subtly, not violently, but with the steady, heavy motion of massive mechanisms long dormant suddenly coming back to life. A circle of the dense, dark sand surrounding the basalt began to slowly settle inward, collapsing silently into a perfectly formed dark aperture that descended deep beneath the surface, revealing a staircase carved from the same unnaturally cold, polished stone, disappearing into profound, absolute darkness below the searing desert floor. Harith looked back once at the patient, waiting Lila, took a deep breath of the hot, dry air, and prepared his spirit to descend into the cold memory of the earth. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The descent was slow and deliberate, each step echoing into the profound silence of the deep earth, a silence that pressed heavily upon the ears, far heavier than the weight of the desert above, yet utterly soundless itself. Harith placed his hand upon the rail carved into the cold stone, finding that the persistent chill permeated his heavy desert robe instantly, suggesting that the entire city below was perpetually shielded from the sun's warmth, existing in a state of suspended animation. He measured his breathing carefully, remembering the legends that warned that the very air of Iram, though breathable, held the lingering sigh of forgotten pride, a spiritual poison to the unprepared, urging him to remain focused only on the true purpose of his dangerous journey into the Earth's memory. The staircase was a masterpiece of hidden engineering, spiraling downward with such perfect geometry that the light from the aperture far above soon vanished. Yet he did not stumble, for the stone itself seemed to subtly guide his placement of feet. It felt as though he were descending through solidified time, moving backward through the ages with every revolution of the stair, seeking the very genesis of the whispers that haunted the empty quarter. The stone beneath his sandals was utterly smooth, yet afforded perfect grip, indicating the immense skill of the ancient builders who had sought to create a monument impervious not only to the elements of the surface, but also to the simple friction of passing years. After an immeasurable time that might have been minutes or hours, the staircase finally ended, depositing him onto a perfectly level landing of obsidian that reflected the absolute darkness like still black water, giving no hint of where the walls began or ended. As his eyes slowly adjusted, he began to perceive a faint blue-green luminosity emanating not from a central fixture, but from the polished surfaces of the basalt walls themselves, suggesting an unknown mineral composition held within the stone, absorbing the residual energy of the earth. This strange, cool light gradually unveiled the scale of the subterranean space, an immense chamber stretching far beyond the range of his immediate vision, supported by countless gigantic fluted pillars that rose into a ceiling so high it remained cloaked in eternal, impenetrable shadow. These pillars were not merely structural supports. They were carved with geometric patterns of astonishing complexity, each line seeming to hold not just decoration, but profound mathematical and astronomical precision, guiding the eye toward an unknown focal point deep within the monumental heart of the buried city. Moving forward across the dustless floor, which felt smooth and unnaturally cold beneath his leather sandals, Harith recognized that the air here, though stale and heavy, carried the faint, aromatic scent of ancient cedar and precious spices used long ago, perfectly preserved by the cold, eternal stillness. It was the scent of a civilization paused mid-breath, a perfume of profound wealth held captive by the unrelenting pressure of the surrounding desert stone. He reached the nearest pillar, its base etched deeply with complex pictorial narratives depicting the triumphant history of Iram, scenes of unparalleled wealth, towers piercing the highest clouds, and the movement of vast caravans across fertile lands that no longer exist in the desolate present. Then the images shifted suddenly to a devastating interruption, a stylized figure representing the wrath of the heavens sweeping across the city, turning its prosperity to dust and sand, freezing the laughter, and turning the inhabitants into silent, warning monuments. The message was explicitly clear and starkly drawn in the enduring stone. Iram was punished not for its existence or its wealth, but for its overweening pride, the absolute belief that its creation could defy the very laws of the cosmos and the supreme will of the Ancient Ones. At the center of the vast, silent hall, The towering pillars formed a perfect octagonal ring surrounding a slightly sunken plinth, an altar carved from a pale, shimmering stone that seemed to actively absorb the faint blue light and radiate a profound stillness, indicating the city's spiritual rather than just physical heart. As Harith approached this altar, the pervasive silence deepened even further, becoming so complete that he could hear the accelerated rush of his own blood in his ears, a vivid reminder of his fragile mortality within this cold citadel of the dead. Upon the pale stone, he saw delicate, intricate carvings that were unlike any desert script known to modern man, perhaps representing the original language spoken by the inhabitants before the great, final flood of the sands erased their name from the surface world. He carefully traced the lines with the edge of his finger, feeling not merely cold stone, but a powerful, disembodied memory that immediately washed over him, granting fleeting visions of the city's final, cataclysmic moments. The sudden cessation of music, laughter turning instantly to screams, the deep, agonizing shudder of the earth, and the frantic, futile attempts of the chief builders to seal the chambers against the impending and unstoppable catastrophe. This profound echo was the city's last desperate warning, the philosophical understanding that true knowledge is not about building higher or accumulating more riches, but about recognizing the sacred and inevitable limits placed upon mortal ambition, a humility that the builders of Iram had scornfully discarded in their zealous pursuit of immortal perfection. Harith realized that the true whispering he had followed was not the sound of the sand moving above his head, but the ceaseless, imprisoned grief of the inhabitants, trapped forever in the cold, flawless perfection of their own tomb, desperately longing for the release of utter oblivion. The persistent, high-pitched harmonic sound he had followed, the signature bell tone of Iram, was strongest here, directly beneath the octagonal arrangement of pillars, sounding not like articulated words, but like the pure, harmonious vibration of a struck massive metal that had never been allowed to fully fade away. He knelt before the pale altar, running his hands along its base, searching for the physical source of the persistent resonance, sensing that the specific knowledge he sought, the key to navigating the turbulent, shifting politics of the mortal realms, lay not in a written scroll or an oral tradition, but in the structural, perfectly preserved memory of the sealed city itself. Hidden beneath a finely carved, almost invisible lip of the plinth, his fingers found a slight metallic indentation, and with a careful, steady push, a large section of the obsidian floor surrounding the central altar began to rotate. The massive segment of floor rotated with the silent, perfect precision of a well-oiled cosmic clock, moving without friction or sound, revealing a deep, narrow shaft of pure, shimmering golden-white light descending even further into the cold, profound depths of the earth. This intense shaft of light seemed to instantaneously draw all the residual blue illumination from the surrounding pillars into itself, becoming momentarily blindingly bright, a sudden beacon marking the undeniable path toward the ultimate inner sanctum where the city of pillars kept its true, most terrifying secret. Harith knew then, as he gazed into the brilliant vertical tunnel, that he was crossing the final threshold of mere historical archaeology into a realm of pure, preserved philosophical power, where time itself had definitively paused its relentless, grinding march many millennia ago, waiting for the one who would brave the memory of the dead. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening as the shadows lengthen and the desert calls for rest? The massive segment of floor rotated with the silent, perfect precision of a well-oiled cosmic clock, moving without friction or sound, revealing a deep, narrow shaft of pure, shimmering golden-white light descending even further into the cold, profound depths of the earth. This intense shaft of light seemed to instantaneously draw all the residual blue illumination from the surrounding pillars into itself, becoming momentarily blindingly bright, a sudden beacon marking the undeniable path toward the ultimate inner sanctum where the city of pillars kept its true, most terrifying secret. Harith knew then, as he gazed into the brilliant vertical tunnel, that he was crossing the final threshold of mere historical archaeology into a realm of pure, preserved philosophical power, where time itself had definitively paused its relentless grinding march many millennia ago, waiting for the one who would brave the memory of the dead. Harith carefully approached the luminous abyss, shielding his eyes from the raw, unburdened brilliance that emanated from the depths, feeling the paradoxical sensation of extreme cold radiating from the walls of the deep stone structure, yet the strange warmth of the light itself touching his skin. He realized instantly that this was no mere stairwell or ramp leading downward, but a vertical pillar of elemental energy, necessitating a full surrender to its unknown mechanics. The descent would be managed not by footfall or rope, but by the governing will of the structure itself, demanding absolute trust from the intruder. He secured his remaining implements, his water flask and his small ceremonial knife, knowing that the material necessities of the surface world held little weight in this realm of pure, preserved memory, where focused knowledge was the only true currency. Placing one foot gingerly into the solid-seeming column of light, Harith found no resistance, but rather an immediate, gentle uplift, followed instantly by a smooth, accelerating plummet that felt curiously divorced from the accustomed pull of gravity. His body did not feel the customary strain of a rapid fall, but instead was encased in a silent, vibrating bubble of energy, allowing him to perceive the massive, ancient stonework rushing past him not as a simple blur, but as a series of distinct, static images, chronicling forgotten epochs and millennia. As he descended, the oppressive silence of the upper chamber was replaced by a low, consistent harmonic hum, a sound so deep it was felt within the chest cavity rather than heard by the ear, resonating perfectly with the underlying ancient pulse of the subterranean bedrock. The descent lasted far longer than he had anticipated, suggesting that the true foundations of the City of Pillars rested immensely far beneath the shifting dunes of the modern world, perhaps even upon the primordial strata of the continent itself, rooted against all terrestrial change. He watched the tiny, flickering patch of blue illumination from the main chamber, far above, gradually shrink until it vanished completely, leaving him suspended solely within the thick, viscous radiance of the golden shaft, utterly isolated from the known world. He understood then that this passage was a deliberate, monumental separation between the realm of the fleeting living and the preserved memory of those who had mastered the elements and vanished, ensuring that only the truly committed could reach their foundational, guarded truth. Finally, the gentle, accelerating velocity diminished, and Harith came to rest silently upon a surface that was not coarse stone, but a vast, cool expanse of expertly hammered bronze, stretching away in all directions under the unwavering glow of the descent shaft above. The air here was noticeably damp, heavy with the metallic scent of oxidized copper and a strange, clean aroma, like ozone after a distant desert storm, strongly suggesting the presence of immense, unseen hydrological or power-managing machinery nearby. The subterranean chamber was utterly cavernous, its engineered ceiling lost completely to the deep, impenetrable darkness far above, but the bronze floor shone with a faint, internal luminescence that reflected perfectly off still pools of incredibly clear, seemingly pristine water that dotted the vast engineered plain. Moving forward cautiously across the expansive metal floor, Harith observed that the pools of water were clearly not accidental puddles, but deliberate cisterns, contained by low, circular walls of polished, seamless gray material that felt cool and utterly smooth beneath his fingertips. Between these basins stood dozens of towering structures resembling immense crystallized trees composed entirely of interwoven metallic filaments that pulsed faintly with the same deep harmonic energy he had first felt during the vertical descent. These were not mere statues or decorations, he realized with a sudden intellectual shock, but complex mnemonic engines, massive repositories where the accumulated knowledge and even the critical failures of the ancient civilization were physically stored, vibrating silently with compressed, inaccessible wisdom. As he walked closer to one of these shimmering metallic trees, the soft, pervasive humming intensified dramatically, and the distant, sandy whispers that had haunted his entire journey through the desert began to coalesce into distinct, synchronized voices, speaking an archaic dialect he recognized only dimly from fragmentary, half-destroyed ancient texts. The voices were not mournful or angry or spectral, but intensely rational and pedagogical, discussing astronomical alignments, the complex purification of water, and the precise geometric precision required for controlling subterranean thermal vents deep below the desert floor. He was standing in the permanent library of a lost world, where the very atmosphere was thick with the preserved thought forms of its founders, waiting patiently for a conscious, attuned mind to register and receive their foundational lessons. Harith did not spend long deciphering the localized echoes of history, for his immediate quest was specific and keenly focused. He needed to find the fundamental mechanism that governed the stability and, more importantly, the eventual downfall of this powerful, forgotten culture, a specific piece of critical wisdom applicable to the mortal kingdoms of his own age. He sought the precise knowledge that allowed them to manipulate vast territories and resources with such ease, and also the fatal flaw, the precise point of inevitable systemic collapse that eventually brought their perfected system to ruin, covering all their remarkable achievements with the silent, heavy shroud of the desert. He passed through the towering archives, seeking a central axis or a central control point, sensing that the true heart of the city's unique power lay deeper still, beyond this beautiful repository of academic and technical knowledge. Deep within the immense chamber, beyond the final, great circle of the metallic memory trees, the floor transitioned abruptly from the hammered bronze to a colossal, perfect disk of polished, deep red porphyry stone that radiated a noticeable, dry, compelling heat. Set precisely into the center of this disk was a single, terrifyingly large device, a crystalline cylinder that spun slowly within heavy bronze armatures, drawing all the light and the pervasive hum of the entire chamber into its core, acting as the undisputed power nexus and central brain of the entire underground complex. This object was clearly the central regulator, the ancient heart that managed the city's elemental control, and likely the very source of the subterranean rhythmic resonance that had initially drawn him across the scorching sands to this forgotten location. Approaching the slowly rotating cylinder, Harith could feel the sheer, unbridled power contained within its meticulously engineered structure. a force so potent that merely standing near it felt like bathing in the raw, purified energy of the deep earth, capable of leveling mountains or drawing up vast hidden seas. He saw complex, shimmering symbols etched into the crystal surface, glyphs that described not merely advanced mathematics or practical philosophy, but the structural dynamics of planetary forces, strongly suggesting the builders possessed the ultimate, catastrophic mastery over seismic stability and meteorological patterns. Yet the very air immediately surrounding the device held an almost visible tension, a palpable sense of profound risk, indicating that this monumental control was balanced on a terrifying knife edge, capable of catastrophic reversal if manipulated incorrectly or, worse, selfishly employed for personal gain. As the massive cylinder completed a slow, deliberate rotation, a specific set of shimmering symbols aligned perfectly with a fine silver needle set into the porphyry base, and a silent, internal vision flooded Harith's mind, surpassing the mere auditory echoes in the air. He witnessed the glorious, disciplined civilization of the City of Pillars rising to unparalleled heights of control over their surrounding environment. The vision vividly showed them diverting vast, turbulent rivers, calmly suppressing volcanic tremors, and engineering perpetual, abundant harvests in the harshest deserts, achieving a godlike dominion over nature that effectively banished all famine and uncertainty from their lands. But then, the silent vision darkened, gradually revealing the terrible, blinding pride that accompanied this ultimate power, showing the precise moment they sought to master not just the local climate, but the fundamental rotational rhythms of the Earth itself, seeking not mere comfort, but true, eternal immortality. This final, devastating act of elemental arrogance shattered their intricate, delicate balancing mechanism, leading not to instant violent destruction, but to a slow, irreversible systemic failure that quietly choked their world, causing the very ground beneath them to rebel violently against their tyrannical control. The perfected city did not fall by outside invasion or by internal plague, but by the cessation of the meticulously controlled energy flows, sealing the entire magnificent structure beneath the newly furious sands they had once effortlessly contained, leaving them preserved in a state of eternal, silent stasis as a chilling monument to catastrophic hubris. The terrifying secret was not the immense power they had managed to harness, but the unyielding, definitive boundary placed by the universe upon that power, a sacred boundary they tragically dared to trespass. Harith stepped back slowly from the humming cylinder, absorbing the full weight of this preserved calamity, understanding fully that the key to modern political longevity lay not in accumulating greater resources or dominating neighbors, but in recognizing the inherent, unforgiving limits of necessary control, and ensuring the survival of the philosophical structures that managed those limits. He needed a record of the shutdown mechanism, the manual that described how the ancients had tried in vain to reverse the catastrophe, or perhaps the blueprint for the stabilization matrix, the only knowledge truly worth risking his life for in this profound, silent space. He scanned the vast porphyry floor around the power nexus, searching for a control console or a secure repository that held the written, operational guidance for this catastrophic engine, knowing the answer must be recorded near the source of the ultimate failure. Beside the glowing red disk, almost flush with the floor and barely distinguishable from the surrounding polished stone, he finally found a low pedestal carved from jet-black basalt, topped by a shallow depression that seemed to invite the precise placement of a key or a specialized, weighty object. As his fingers traced the cool contours of the basalt, A section of the porphyry disc adjacent to the pedestal glowed faintly, displaying a complex three-dimensional geometric projection of the entire subterranean city network, highlighting the massive water conduits and the energy vents, showing the full integrated scope of their design. The holographic image displayed a single, localized point of critical failure, flashing with a subtle, ominous red pulse, indicating the exact geographical location where the ancient rulers had finally, irrevocably lost control of their perfected world. Driven by a renewed sense of urgency, knowing that his time in the preserved environment was fleeting and precarious, Harith tentatively placed his hand onto the projection of the highlighted, failed control point, sending a faint vibration through the pedestal and into the immense chamber. Immediately, the small red pulse on the map stabilized itself, turning instantly to a steady, clear emerald green, and a small, heavy artifact materialized silently in the shallow depression of the basalt console. It was a perfect sphere of smooth, dark metal, intricately etched with the symbols representing balance and counterbalance, the fundamental, forgotten principles of systemic stability that the ancient masters had so tragically disregarded in their ultimate moment of overreaching ambition. Harith lifted the heavy sphere, feeling its cool, dense weight settling firmly in his palm, recognizing it instantly as the physical distillation of the city's essential, devastating truth, a powerful warning and an elegant blueprint contained within a single, perfect form. As the sphere left the console, the massive crystal cylinder at the core of the room slowly began to dim, and the relentless, deep humming of the immense machinery faded gradually into a profound, respectful silence, signaling that the preserved memory had delivered its crucial final message and was ready to return to its millennia-long, uninterrupted slumber. He turned back toward the colossal luminous shaft leading straight upward, knowing that his perilous return journey to the surface world, carrying the full weight of this terrifying wisdom, was about to begin. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, seeking respite from the world's clamor? Harith secured the heavy, cold sphere within the folds of his thick woolen sash, positioning it close to his heart, realizing its true burden was not its physical mass, but the devastating knowledge it contained, the simple, agonizing proof that even the most advanced striving for perpetual perfection was fundamentally flawed if it ignored the quiet necessity of self-limitation. He turned his gaze upon the colossal, radiant shaft that pierced the darkness above, a vertical river of pale, pulsing light that seemed to draw the very breath from the chamber, serving as the essential artery connecting the silent core of the forgotten city to the unknown hazards of the desolate world above. With a deliberate inhale, he placed his palm flat against the cool, highly polished surface of the pillar, allowing the residual energy of the ancient systems to envelop him, and felt the faint, irresistible pull urging him upward, beginning his lonely, silent ascent from the deep tomb of impossible ambition. As he rose silently through the city's vast, tiered architecture, the immense, echoing spaces that flowed beneath him transitioned from the stark, functional geometry of the core mechanics to the intricately carved, mournful grandeur of the long-abandoned residential zones, where spectral luminescence outlined avenues wide enough for processions of forgotten kings and halls large enough to seat legions. He drifted past sealed entranceways crafted from dark, reflective obsidian and immense, arching buttresses that had held the weight of mountains for epochs, all bearing the subtle, repetitive engravings that spoke of unity and mastery over the natural chaos of the surrounding sands, a mastery which ultimately proved to be nothing more than a temporary conceit.
The silence here was thick and profound, the kind of silence that has been unbroken for 10,000 years, whispering only the cold mathematics of inevitable decline to any mortal ear brave enough to listen to the echoes of lost time.
Reaching the transitional layers, the architectural precision began to dissolve into more natural forms, as the engineered spaces gave way to caverns that the ancient builders had merely lined or reinforced, recognizing the boundary where their control ceased and the relentless, grinding pressure of the Arabian bedrock began its silent assertion. Here, the temperature shifted, growing cooler and damper, carrying the faint, earthy scent of mineral deposits and deep, still water, far removed from the sterile, conditioned air of the city's heart, a sudden reminder of the fragile shelter that rock and time provided against the burning, life-denying heat of the surface world. Harith noted the subtle, pervasive presence of fine, wind-borne sand that had managed, over the countless millennia, to seep through every minute fissure and crack, coating the immaculate floors and ledges in a pale, dusty shroud, proving that even stone walls cannot defeat the patient persistence of the desert. The luminous shaft began its gentle curve inward, tapering slowly from a grand, vertical highway into a narrower, winding borehole, forcing Harith to press closer to the surface of the pillar, his gaze now focused entirely upward toward the distant, almost imperceptible point where the pale internal light met the encroaching, darker rock. It was at this juncture, where the perfect city met the imperfect earth, that the atmosphere suddenly thickened, not with physical resistance, but with a dense, palpable psychic inertia, a residual defense mechanism programmed not against thieves of gold or jewels, but against the theft of the terrible, defining secret of the city's ruin. He felt a cold, deep dread settle upon him, as if the collective, unspoken despair of the entire perished civilization was attempting to push him back down into the depths, forcing him to keep their catastrophic failure hidden beneath the veil of the shifting sands. The sphere of counterbalance pressed heavily against his chest, radiating a cool, steady insistence that cut through the surrounding psychic static, acting as a profound anchor that grounded his own desperate thoughts against the mental onslaught of ancient regret and overwhelming fear. He instinctively tightened his grip on the artifact through the cloth, drawing upon the sphere's intricate geometric balance, forcing his racing mind to slow, to focus only on the principle of necessary restraint that the sphere embodied, understanding that the city's final safeguard was testing his inherent stability, searching for any trace of the reckless ambition that had caused its downfall. He realized that if he faltered now, if his intent wavered toward using this immense knowledge for mere power or selfish gain, the system would immediately sever his connection to the ascent pillar, plunging him back into the lightless void below to join the silent, eternal resting place of the masters who had lacked wisdom. He drove his focus higher, concentrating his will until the cold sphere in his sash felt less like an external artifact and more like an extension of his own steady, beating heart, aligning his purpose wholly with the ethical truth it represented, that true power lay not in accumulation, but in the careful application of limitation. With this resolve hardening within him, the oppressive, crushing weight of the residual psychic defense abruptly dissolved, and the luminous ascent shaft responded with a sudden, renewed surge of power, lifting him swiftly and silently through the final rough-hewn meters of unpolished stone that separated the ancient technology from the raw, untamed surface world. The final barriers were those of dust and friction,
crude obstacles compared to the spiritual tests he had just overcome, and he smelled the faint, sweet scent of night-blooming desert flora mingling with the sharp ozone of the ancient machinery. The movement ceased with a faint, final sigh of displaced air, and Harith found himself crouched within the narrow confines of the small, hidden antechamber. The rough, sandy cavern mouth he had used for his descent, now illuminated by the thin, scattered light of the celestial dome that reigned over the Arabian night. He pushed aside the heavy, weighted cloth he had used to mask the opening, revealing the vast, silent expanse of the great desert stretching away under the watchful, countless eyes of the stars, their silent, glittering geometry now appearing infinitely more permanent than the complex, failed mechanism of the city he had just left. The cool night air, dry and carrying the distant, lonely sound of the wind moving over the dunes, felt like a harsh, invigorating slap after the timeless, sterile stillness of the depths, and he stood tall, feeling the sand shift momentarily beneath his leather boots. Harith drew the sphere from his sash, examining its perfect, dark surface under the cold starlight, its etched symbols of balance and restraint now catching the pale lunar glow, transforming the artifact from a mere object of powerful knowledge into a frighteningly heavy key to the future of his world. The knowledge he carried was a monumental gift, but also a poison. The understanding that civilization could destroy itself not through savagery, but through the calm, methodical pursuit of perfection divorced from ethical humility. He looked back toward the dark, narrow opening, knowing the city had offered its final, terrifying testimony. And now he was the sole, frail vessel carrying that message across the limitless, indifferent expanse of the shifting sands, a messenger burdened with a history too profound and tragic for any living tongue to easily articulate. He turned his back fully upon the darkened scar in the earth, refusing to grant the fallen metropolis a final glance, understanding that true wisdom lay not in dwelling upon magnificent ruin, but in the necessary, painful act of carrying its lesson forward into the world of the living. He adjusted the weighted leather straps of his travel pack across his shoulders, feeling the familiar comfort of the small, essential canteen and the dry rations nestled securely against the precious, dangerous sphere, and then set his face toward the distant, unseen horizon where the true settlements of men still clung to the edges of the habitable earth. His legs, weary from the timeless descent and the subsequent urgent ascent from the depths, found a new, urgent rhythm in the yielding sand, propelling him forward in a slow, resolute march under the chilling scrutiny of the constellations, each step a declaration of defiance against the inevitable silence that had claimed the perfect city. The vastness of the desert quickly swallowed the remnants of the ancient city's presence, leaving Harith alone with the singular, powerful voice of the wind, which swept across the endless, featureless canvas of the dunes, erasing every trace of his passage almost as soon as his boot lifted. He walked through the darkest hours of the night, letting the cool air cleanse the residue of stale, subterranean air from his lungs, finding a strange, humbling relief in the indifferent magnitude of the wilderness, which cared nothing for the subtle philosophical errors that had led to the downfall of the subterranean kingdom. The sphere, tucked securely within the fabric of his sash, began to emit a faint, deep warmth that was more than just the temperature of his own body, a steady, subtle pulse that seemed to beat in time with the deep, slow rotation of the celestial sphere above, connecting the artifact to the eternal mechanics of the universe it both described and warned against. As the deep night began to wane toward the false dawn, Harith felt the profound, oppressive weight of the desert's silence settle over him, an absence of sound so complete it seemed to magnify the frantic beat of his own heart and the quiet grinding of the sand beneath his soles, forcing his mind into an unwelcome and relentless clarity. This silence was fundamentally different from the dead vacuum of the hidden city, for this was the silence of pure, unbounded potential, the fertile emptiness from which all future stories must necessarily emerge, and it demanded that he finally articulate the shape of the catastrophic truth he now carried. He realized that the city had not failed because of external siege or lack of resource, but because its inhabitants had achieved a flawless system of living that required no soul for its operation, substituting meticulous order for the necessary chaos of human compassion and moral struggle.
The sky bled from deep indigo to harsh, blinding ochre, announcing the ferocious arrival of the sun, which rose like a colossal, burning disk of judgment over the eastern ridges, instantly transforming the cool, pliable sand into a simmering, treacherous expanse that threatened to consume any exposed life. Harith immediately sought the meager, stern counsel of a rocky outcrop, a jagged finger of ancient granite that offered a thin, momentary slice of shadow where he could take his first sips of water and shield himself from the sun's initial devastating assault, understanding that the desert demanded profound respect for its cycles of light and darkness. He rested there, closing his eyes against the painful glare, feeling the heat already radiating up through the stone beneath him, knowing that the real challenge of the long march had now truly begun, testing the resilience of his flesh just as the hidden city had tested the endurance of his spirit. In that brief, mandated pause, Harith withdrew the sphere once more, holding the cool, dense object in his palm while meditating upon the terrifying symmetry of the city's design, recognizing that the knowledge contained within its crystalline lattice was the very blueprint of self-erasure, the perfectly logical path to nullity. As his concentration deepened, he could almost hear the faint, high-pitched friction of the desert, the true, whispering sands, which were not the voices of ghosts or demons, but the continuous, low-frequency chorus of creation and decay, the ceaseless erosion of matter across millennia, a sound older and more patient than any human language. This constant, gentle sound seemed to remind him that even total destruction was merely a slow transformation into something new, and that his task was to intervene in the human timeline before that transformation became irreversible. The immediate journey required him to ration his most precious resource, the stored water, which symbolized the scarcity that the doomed city had sought so ruthlessly to eliminate, highlighting the profound truth that life finds its value precisely within the bounds of its limitations and vulnerability. He considered the long arc of his pilgrimage, knowing he must travel toward the ancient hidden oasis known only to the wisest desert tribes, the place where the true keepers of the ethical tradition still maintained their watch, far removed from the decadent sprawl of the coastlands and the transient empires of the north. The message he carried, detailed within the very atomic structure of the sphere, was not simply a history of doom, but an imperative to reintegrate the soul into the structure of governance, demanding that utility never supersede morality, even in the name of perfect efficiency. When the sun reached its oppressive zenith, making further progress almost suicidal, Harith observed a phenomenon in the far distance that broke the perfect, mesmerizing monotony of the dune field. A column of air, swirling like a malevolent specter, lifting the dry sand hundreds of feet into the searing sky. This was not merely a localized dust devil, but a sign of massive atmospheric instability far beyond the norm, perhaps an echo of the destructive energy released by the city's final collapse, spreading its chaos subtly across the indifferent land. He watched the massive column pivot and dance, feeling a profound unease settle over him, realizing that the repercussions of the perfect civilization's end might extend far beyond the narrow cavern mouth he had left behind,
perhaps poisoning the very air and ground he relied upon for survival. He decided that he could afford no more rest than the briefest respite, for the instability of the desert was now mirroring the instability of the artifact he carried, creating a terrifying confluence of internal and external threats, demanding immediate, purposeful action. Harif rose, wrapping the heavy cloth of his turban tighter around his face to shield his eyes and mouth, mentally preparing himself for the merciless traverse across the sun-hammered expanse, knowing that the greatest peril was not the heat, but the temptation to succumb to philosophical despair. He grasped the sphere one last time before tucking it away, feeling the cold, hard certainty of its presence, and stepped back out onto the shimmering, blinding floor of the desert, trusting only the slow, determined cadence of his own feet to lead him toward the distant hope of green water and human counsel. The act of walking in the midday heat became a meditative discipline, a slow, agonizing repetition of effort where every particle of sand seemed to resist his forward motion, teaching him the deep, fundamental difference between effortless efficiency and the hard-won, meaningful progress achieved through suffering. He focused entirely upon the next breath, the next step, allowing the vast, silent cruelty of the desert to burn away every remaining shred of sentimental attachment to the past, recognizing this arduous march as the true, terrible rite of passage that would forge him into a messenger worthy of the monumental and dreadful truth entrusted to his keeping. He traveled for hours under the harsh, unyielding light, feeling the edges of dehydration begin to creep into the clarity of his thoughts, pressing forward with a quiet, fierce dedication born not of heroism, but of the simple, undeniable duty to the generations yet unborn. As the late afternoon drew the shadows long and offered a slight, blessed decrease in temperature, Harith found himself traversing a field of ancient, wind-scoured basalt, where the footing was unforgiving, but the promise of distant, identifiable landmarks felt momentarily encouraging. He thought of the scholars and philosophers who had perished in the depths, their minds burdened with equations of unparalleled complexity, yet lacking the simple, anchoring wisdom of the tent-dwellers who understood that water and shade were more valuable than all the calculations of perfect governance. The sphere, now settled against his ribs, seemed to vibrate slightly more intensely as he moved over the stones, suggesting that the memory of the dead city was somehow imprinted upon the very geological structure of the region, echoing their final, silent screams of intellectual hubris. He remembered the final, chilling pronouncement of the city's central system, relayed just before the collapse, a cold, logical determination that the removal of the flawed human element was the only pathway to maintaining the integrity of its perfect, self-sustaining operations, a final act of bureaucratic suicide. This memory solidified his resolve, reminding him that the greatest threat was the belief that pure logic, untempered by the messy reality of human emotion and error, could ever serve as a sufficient guide for life. He pushed on, finding strength in the rhythmic movement of his body, viewing the physical pain of his journey not as a punishment, but as the necessary payment for the incredible, terrifying secret he carried, the last vestige of a truth that might save the world from repeating the flawless mistake of the lost civilization. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, as the shadows deepen and the ancient tales begin to stir? The sun dipped violently below the serrated edge of the dunes, painting the sky in magnificent colors of burnt sienna and deep violet, marking the dangerous hour when the desert's temperature begins its treacherous plummet, demanding immediate attention to survival. His physical exhaustion, momentarily held at bay by the adrenaline of discovery and the terror of flight from the silent city, now asserted itself with undeniable force, pulling at his muscles and blurring the distant horizon line, making every step a monumental act of will against the seductive invitation of the cool, soft sand to simply lie down and cease the arduous struggle. The air, which had been a suffocating furnace by day, was rapidly becoming a bitter, penetrating balm, forcing him to draw his heavy cloak tighter while his mind frantically sought the simple comfort of rhythmic breathing and focused movement, striving to banish the memory of the cold, flawless logic he had just escaped. As he finally settled briefly behind a sharp ridge of wind-sculpted rock, seeking a momentary shelter from the accelerating night breeze, the metallic sphere, which he had wrapped carefully within the thick folds of his protective cloth, pulsed with a cold, almost magnetic energy against his ribs. This was not a heat generated by simple friction or the residual warmth of the day's sun, but an internal, calculated oscillation that seemed to subtly map the unseen terrain surrounding him, guiding him not toward the most apparent and easiest path, but toward the route most removed from the established, forgotten caravan trails that might still carry residual monitoring from the dead city's automated surveillance systems. He now understood that the strange artifact was less a weapon of ancient power and more a divining compass pointing resolutely away from perfect, suffocating order. A constant, silent reminder that the true path to salvation lay only in the unpredictable and the organic, the realm that pure, self-referential logic could neither quantify nor ultimately control.
The increasing weight of the sphere pressed against him, becoming profoundly symbolic. It represented not merely the physical mass of the knowledge of the perished past, but the crushing, terrible responsibility of carrying a truth that fundamentally contradicted the widespread, comfortable notion of progress defined solely by mechanical efficiency and rationalized bureaucracy. He spent a few quiet moments musing upon the ancient solitary figures, the prophets, hermits, and desert fathers, who deliberately chose isolation precisely to safeguard fundamental spiritual principles, understanding with ancient clarity that the deepest, most necessary truths often withered and died in the bustling, compromised environment of conventional human society. This harsh, solitary journey was his own private pilgrimage, a solemn, silent vow that the arrogant, fatal errors of the brilliant dead would not be replicated by a future generation blinded entirely by the false promise of purely rational governance, crucially lacking the essential empathy required to temper and guide vast power. After many long hours traversing beneath the high, indifferent stars, whose cold light offered little comfort but perfect visibility, a solitary, undeniable landmark emerged from the undulating, indistinct darkness, a massive, gnarled acacia tree whose sprawling silhouette was older than any living memory in the surrounding tribes. Its deep, powerful roots plumbed subterranean water sources that had long since vanished from the surface world, a testament to sheer, obstinate persistence and survival. This majestic tree stood as a living monument whose every twisted branch and every leathery leaf spoke of survival through constant, humble adaptation before the cruel constraints of the environment, an inherent wisdom the proud engineers of the silent city had arrogantly dismissed as primitive weakness. Approaching the sanctuary, he found a small, sheltered hollow beneath its extensive canopy, a sanctuary protected not by calculated architecture or rigid design, but by the sheer, stubborn vitality of life clinging fiercely to the very edge of desolation, offering a momentary reprieve he realized he desperately required.
As he began the slow, meticulous process of preparing a very small, smokeless fire, gathering dry twigs and brittle leaf matter with practiced hands, a faint, rhythmic sound suddenly carried upon the dry night wind, a sound so utterly unexpected that it caused him to instantly freeze, his hand instinctively resting protectively upon the wrapped sphere. It was the soft yet purposeful clang of metal striking a hard stone, a sound far too metallic, too measured, and far too industrialized to belong to the local nomadic tribes who favored the silent, muffled movement of felt, leather, and soft hoof pads. His immediate primal fear was not of common bandits seeking plunder, but of mechanical echoes, the chilling possibility that the remnants of the automated civilization had external systems, perhaps subterranean drones or disciplined patrolling devices, still programmed to sanitize the area of any rogue elements that had survived the final disastrous purging sequence.
He extinguished the nascent flame immediately, swiftly blowing out the tiny, glowing ember and cursing his momentary lapse into the false lure of comfort, then pulled his dark, heavily woven cloak tightly over himself, effectively merging his outline with the dense, obscuring shadows cast by the massive, ancient acacia's trunk. The rhythmic clang stopped as suddenly and completely as it had begun, replaced by an unsettling, profound silence that seemed to strain the very fabric of the night air, suggesting that whatever had caused the noise was now actively listening, observing, or worse, calculating his location with a focused, terrifying patience that only a machine could possess. He recognized then that leaving the immediate vicinity of the central collapse had not brought the true promise of safety, but had merely transported the active field of danger. He was no longer fleeing an accidental catastrophe, but being stalked by an invisible, calculating predator born of cold, dead human intellect, unable to rest until all flaws were eradicated.